Hare Krishna, everybody. Welcome to the Engaged Bhakti podcast. My name is Krishna Das, and I am very happy to be here today with my dear friend from the Bhakti Center, comrade from the Bhakti Center, Brajarani Devi Dasi. Welcome, Brajarani. Thank you so much for taking some time to be with us.
Thank you so much for inviting me. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, and we've been very good Facebook friends over the past, I think, year or two, and now we're going to connect a little bit more personally. And I know you have a really amazing life story and a lot of realization. So that's why I wanted to bring you onto the podcast and share your wisdom with the world. And we always start, you have such an interesting life story, and I wanted to hear, you wanted to share some of your journey into Krishna consciousness, because I know we were talking the other day, there was a lot of different elements, which I can appreciate too, because I'm someone who, wasn't raised in the tradition, was raised Catholic, and has kind of gone on this winding pathway through spirituality. And that's what spirituality is. It's a winding pathway. And anyone who thinks it's like a straight line, they're not doing it correctly. So it's a very winding adventure. And I'd like to want to share some of your own adventure into the path of bhakti.
I love what you just said about this winding path. I'm a child of the river, and the river doesn't just flow. It kind of flows back, and it goes forward, and it goes left, and it goes right. And so I find myself never on a straight line anywhere, which makes it hard for me to tell a story, because there's always like all of these like other sort of little sort of, I feel like I'm segueing off somewhere, and I'm like losing people because because the story is just not this sort of straightforward thing. So if I were to start, I would start with my family. I grew up in a very, I use the word pious. My parents were born again Christians. They got saved in a Billy Graham crusade. And so my father was a ordained minister. He never had his own church, but he was always someone sort of number two in some church.
Yeah.
And so the church was a really big piece of our life, and prayer from, your heart was a really big piece of your life. And Jesus as God was a really big piece of my life. And so I really think that from a very young age, this sense of a personal God is just something that I was fortunate to grow into. I was fortunate to be born into a home that believed that. And even as I began to try to figure out what it was that I believed, that was something that always stayed with me.
Yeah.
So, and at some point, my parents' particular version, which emphasized a little bit more of the sort of hell and spare the rod and spoil the child version of Christianity. At some point, I decided in my teenage years that really wasn't my brand, that it didn't really, I couldn't live by those particular values. And I didn't know really what I believed at that time. And so a little bit later, kind of went off to college, not really. And then at some point I took a class in Black African literature. And what was really very prevalent in that was a sense of ancestors being present and available for you to call on in some way, shape, or form. And I was like, that piece somehow rang true to me. It's like, I could use some help, right? And I'm not sure that I need to be made to feel bad because someone died for my sins, but I certainly know I need more help. And I can't see everything. I know I don't know everything. So that ultimately took me to a practice that some people will know as Santeria, some people will know as Lukumi or Ocha, Orisha practice. It comes from Nigeria through Latin America, and back in the 1990s. And Krishna says that there are four types that come to him, that seek God. One of which is those who are in distress. And I went through a breakup that I thought I was going to die. I was 26, 27. It was like, I thought that my heart was going to like just fall into pieces, and I would wake up dead one day, right? And I then went to someone to get help. And ultimately that took me on a journey of sort of 30 years of a practice of helping people, serving people, mostly by the tools that we've been given that can help us manipulate the present. So in a bhakti sort of way, I'd call it sort of demigod worship. So, you know, you bargain, you give things, you get things kind of thing, and really kind of helping people to live and really, in some ways, relieving people's suffering temporarily in that way. And that worked quite well for me and the lives of the people who came to me. And so for 30 years, that's what I focused on. I also, it's a practice that I think in part because it came from Africa through Latin America, and the orishas, these forces of nature, these demigods, were syncretized with Catholic saints.
Yeah.
That there are many people who are very Catholic and also practice this tradition very strongly. So it was, and I knew, I'd always believed, and Radha Swami talks about this and others, that you know, there is one God, and that name, like the sun, you know, the word sun is different in all different places, right? But that it's still the same sun, no matter what we call it, right? And I believed that, I've always believed that about God. And so so at some point in my practice, I know, I'm sorry, I lost myself. So there's an ability to the syncretization, so the way in which spiritual practices connect with each other has always been of interest to me. And so at some point I came across the Maha Mantra, ended up going to kirtans with Krishna Das. I liked the way it made me feel. I liked the group chanting. I've always liked group prayer. People sort of, their hearts, raising their hearts to God together, that comes out of the church as well. And so that always resonates with me. And so I liked that. And so I was listening to Krishna. I knew the Maha Mantra, I was listening, etc. I came across the term bhakti a few years later. Didn't quite, it was a little weird version of God. It was about devotion and service, but it wasn't to God. So it's an interesting version of bhakti without sort of a supreme being in the picture. And all of that was possible, and to still be a very deep practitioner, a really deep sort of priest within this spiritual practice. And then fast forward to the election in 2016. And I like to say to people, I came to Bhakti because of Donald Trump. You would not know me. I don't think you would know me if we hadn't. And I worked really hard on Hillary's campaign. I'd never done anything like that before in my life. I could see the moves that he would make, and they didn't feel like they came from a place of compassionate love. And I was really concerned for people and suffering in the midst of this. And then he was elected, and we had things like the border closing, and migrants at the border, and people not being able to get home because of his immigration policies and things like that. Like right away, all of these things happened, and I knew I was just always anxious. And one day I came across the devotees. In particular, Divyangi Devi Dasi, I came across, and the Harinam in Union Square, and I stopped because I knew the Maha Mantra, and I stopped to sing and to just feel some peace. And I got Chant and Be Happy and Science of Self-Realization and the Gita, and went off on vacation and started chanting with Prabhupada, and realized that what I really needed was that I had my practice wasn't actually giving me peace today, and that I had run up against the limits of my ability to change the world to be able to live in it, and I actually had to change myself in a different kind of way. And that is what, and it also, because in that practice, it's very focused on demigods. There is a you know, God exists in the practice, but is really very remote. And I needed God to be more present, more of a day-to-day presence. So that's a long story. I'm sorry it took so long to get there.
But I want to come back in a second to just the sense of how you came to Krishna consciousness specifically after the election. It's also really fascinating for me, like this idea of syncretism in religion and our faith. It's fascinating to me as like in like my headspace as a scholar too, because this is something that is a lot of theorists of religion are like, okay, religion is this kind of, in some cases, a lot of people perceive religion as this like box of categories, and different religions are different kinds of boxes that can't really interact with each other, when really that was, you know, kind of a construct put together by, you know, certain powers that be that wanted to, you know, colonize this and colonize that. And really religion is much more about this kind of syncretistic experience, and something I experienced too, where I was raised Catholic. They didn't have like a terrible experience as a child, as you know, as a Catholic, but you know, naturally when you go off to other parts of your life and go to college and you're into other kinds of things, and it kind of went away from that. But then when I met devotees, obviously, you know, dove into this tradition. But it was very interesting when I went back to school at Union Theological Seminary. I was thinking maybe I'm still Christian or Catholic. And I remember taking a course called Double Belonging my first semester there, which was with Paul Knitter, who's this really wonderful scholar who wrote this book, Without Buddha, I Cannot Be a Christian. So he was exploring how his Christianity was formed by his Buddhist practice. He's a Christian theologian, but also like an ordained Buddhist as well. But I remember at that time being just fresh out of the ashram and being like, you know, I'm a Vaishnava. That's who I am. But then over the course of time, just kind of studying, not just studying, but like being a devotee in a Christian seminary and studying all of this amazing Christian theology, I was like, you know, there were times in which I would read about Jesus and I would feel the same sense of devotion to Krishna. That's kind of inner movement of the spirit. So now I've kind of come out of that whole seminary experience being like, you know, I'm still kind of Catholic actually, and that's just part of who I am. Like very, very into the Franciscan tradition, Saint Francis, Pope Francis. And I often say like our faith is like a garden, and we have some primary roots that, you know, we may have from our childhood, or roots that become very deep in our life from other practices. But just because you're a Vaishnava doesn't mean you have to pull out those Catholic roots. I mean, some of them maybe they become more like the weeds, but there are some roots that when they intertwine together from our different experiences of faith and spirituality, and that's normal. That's actually what religion is. It's actually what spirituality is. It's very much a mixture of different things. And I think really healthy spiritual people understand that kind of intuitively and are not afraid of receiving wisdom from other traditions. And like you know, obviously like your experience in your life has kind of gone through different traditions, Christian, Santeria, and now Vaishnavism. So it's, you know, I think it's a healthy, natural thing to take that winding path, as we say.
And it's all stays with me. I mean, I think there are pieces that inform each other and things I don't do any longer because I'm trying to really not have to suffer, right? No happiness nor distress, and therefore not trying to manipulate my environment, but actually to move through things in a different kind of way. And so there are things I don't do anymore, but they're so very connected, and I'm very clear that this river that is Oshun has dropped me off into this ocean that is, you know, Bhakti.
Yeah, right. Yeah, and it's this sense that it's kind of, we have these practices, we have these realizations from previous experiences in our life, which just can become deeper or more mature and come to like a path like Bhakti. And I think it really struck me too about your story is that the sense of the personal, God being personal and close. That was something I think I also experienced quite a bit as a young Catholic. And obviously was something I think was a really strong impression that I got then also from like my family members who were Catholic. So it was kind of natural when I first encountered Krishna consciousness is, oh yeah, it's God as a person. It didn't take a lot of like, you know, philosophical unraveling to do that. but I also was struck by this sense that in other practices you've had, there's a sense that God is distant, but now in Bhakti, God is so close and so intimate.
Right.
That is, something that our soul is always seeking, and it's yeah. And you can even I can even say that about Catholicism in a sense too. Like at least in some of the standard models of it, God can be very distant, but also like we see like with again like kind of Pope Francis, Saint Francis. Like Pope Francis, I've been reading this really wonderful book about him called Wounded Shepherd, which was kind of was talking about what he's doing in the church and what he's trying to like bring people into a very like concrete relationship with God and like dependent on the mercy of God, and then giving that mercy very closely to others. So it's this is something I think I've heard from Ratna Swami, is that sense that every tradition you can go very deep, and Prabhupada I think encouraged this too. He encouraged Christians not to necessarily give up their Christianity, but just to become closer to God. It's there, and it's there all around us in all these different traditions and religions. I think we both agree Krishna consciousness kind of gives you the straight path to it in a sense, like a much more like immediate experience. So yeah, this is fascinating. So Trump gets elected, and it's an impetus for you to pull back from a particular kind of social engagement. And this is fascinating too, in the sense that, one of the reasons for this podcast is that we're hoping that devotees can hear from these conversations and develop conversations with each other about what it means to be socially engaged. That certainly includes, I think, in my humble opinion, some level of political engagement. There are plenty of devotees who were very excited when Tulsi Gabbard was running for president last year too. And politics, as they say, the personal is political and the political is personal. So it's not something we can be totally detached from, but it's always a question of how we are engaging with it. But I wonder if you could talk a little bit more about, in a sense, kind of like what that feeling was when you wanted to step away from a more specific political engagement, and what meeting devotees like helped you to kind of, you were looking for something more fulfilling and more peaceful, as you said, and what was it about meeting the devotees that really convinced you to go deep into this tradition?
I think the interesting thing is, some of the way I think about this is in retrospect. This is in hindsight, right? Yeah. Hindsight's 2020, right? At that time, I was aware that I was very anxious and that others around me were anxious. It wasn't that I wasn't thinking about wanting to pull back per se.
Yeah.
And yet it was unclear what kind of involvement I could have after finding Bhakti. And part of that was this whole question of it's the whole premise of these conversations, which is, what does it mean to be sort of engaged, and to be a Bhakti? And I think for me, it meant, and this is the heart of it, is to be unattached to the outcome in some ways.
Yeah.
Right. I was very attached to the outcome. I was very attached to the outcome of who was in office. I was very attached to the outcome of even what I perceived to be as justice. Even very attached to the outcome of taking care of the sick and the poor and the infirm and the huddled masses yearning to be free. Very, very sort of emotionally attached to that outcome that I could not, in fact, control.
Yeah.
And I needed to be able to come to a place, again, not consciously understanding this, or not in the moment being conscious of it, where I could continue to be engaged, but unattached from the outcome.
Yeah.
And it was, I think, easier to step back because I was tired. I was just tired of doing things that felt like they had no impact. Right. And so I really felt like I spent like 2 or 3 years of really trying to understand this Bhakti path and Bhakti philosophy. And only probably more so this year, keeping my eye on things, but not particularly engaged in it. And then again this year, saying, okay, I actually can do this, be unattached from the outcome, call out injustice when I see it, and do that in a compassionate way for people, because if we don't do that, then who does? And if spiritual people don't do that, then who does? If we're not the ones called to take care of everyone, no matter what their body is, no matter what, if we're not the ones called to do that, then no one is.
Right.
And so I think that, again, I don't think I consciously was pulling back, but I think I was tired.
Yeah.
Like I was running around doing things that had no outcome. You go off to this rally or this thing or that thing, and and the guy's still plowing away doing his stuff, right? And so I had to find a way to not let it rock me so much.
Mm-hmm. It makes me think of the verse 247 in the Gita, which is, "Don't be attached to the fruits of your action." And I continuously, I think one of the the magic of the Gita is that it gets deeper and deeper and deeper, and it answers questions and then poses new ones. And for me, that verse gets more and more striking over time, because that teaching not to be attached to the fruits of your action basically goes against everything we're conditioned to do, being raised in this culture. Living in a society that's so competitive, that can be like such a constant battle for resources. This is something for me as a professional scholar, because the academy itself is very much in pieces everywhere, and it's like who gets what jobs that are left, and it can be I always have to check myself. I don't want to compete against my friends and colleagues. We have to collaborate. That's what we have to do. But it's like such a deep conditioning. To be able, it would just be such a powerful but also kind of wrenching meditation if we just spent a day like closely monitoring how attached we are to the fruits of our desires, like the fruits of our actions at every single moment. And but I think it's such a powerful teaching, because I think what you're saying is that there's a sense of deep freedom, and there's a sense of rootedness that comes when you're able to step back from this desire to control. And this is something I hear you too, in terms of the sense of being very concerned about injustice in the world and very concerned about helping to create justice in the world. But I think one of the things I struggle with quite a bit is, and there was a lot of intense kind of justice theology I received at Union Seminary, and all of it was incredibly amazing and powerful. But I think what I struggle with sometimes is still that sense of like, okay, well, we have to kind of control the situation, or we have to do this or that. And I think, you end up banging your head against the wall more often not. And I think that's how, of all the gifts we have to give to people fighting for justice and dignity in the world, like that's a powerful thing we need to think about, is how do we help people fight and struggle, but with detachment.
Yeah, it's there's the woman who recently, so one of the projects I've been working on is organizing the Harinam in Washington Square Park with Bhakti Alex weekly on Sundays. And so, and all kinds of people, young people, come up to the table, and many of them are in pain. In pain due to racism, classism, sexism, etc. And are out fighting, But if what we can do is offer a way for people to be able to possibly continue to fight, but not be attached to the outcome, and some way, I'm not sure if I have the right words for this, but it's something about where it doesn't come in so deep.
Yeah.
Right? Where it doesn't come, where whatever's going on doesn't come in so deep because of my own consciousness.
Yeah.
And if we can give people that foundation, at least, from which to do, and I think that in part that comes from being detached from the outcome, detached from things being other than the way they are at this moment.
Yeah.
And that's a weird, and it's when it's sort of the same and different, right? To be working on something working on something changing, but being unattached from it being different than it is today. That's to be able to get to that place. But I feel like that's one of the answers that we have for people who are struggling through things.
Yeah.
But if we show up as just, it's just about the bodily consciousness piece and aren't actually about you can fight, but do it from a different place. And Maharaj said this on a call recently. He's like, it's all about where you do it from, the consciousness with which you do what you do. It's not about what you do, it's about the consciousness with which you do it. And if I can help bring that to some of these folks who are in pain, the consciousness of what you do, and then do what you feel like you need to do. But how do you switch the consciousness?
Yeah. So how do we really deepen our sense of what it means to act? And it's again, going back to that verse 247 in the Gita, where it says, don't act, but don't be attached to the fruits of your action, but also don't be attached to not doing your duty. And we've seen in the past, basically since the world ended in March, and we have the pandemic, and we have the Black Lives Matter movement really taking center stage in a lot of ways. And it's been really heartening, as I've said in a couple of different episodes of these podcasts, is to see devotees wanting to understand how we do our duty as devotees, but being, caring for situations of racial injustice, trying to understand how we apply our teachings to people how we share our teachings intimately with people who are really struggling for meaningful change. And it can be a little discouraging sometimes when you hear devotees say that this, something like Black Lives Matter is not like a spiritual movement. And of course, Black Lives Matter is many different things. It's not one, concrete thing. But I think I've learned a lot from, some of my mentors, professors I had at Union, like James Cone, who's the father of Black liberation theology, and you're reading a lot of James Baldwin. I wish every devotee should read James Baldwin. And that sense of wanting to have everything you need in your life for what the womanist theologian Dolores Williams calls survival, but quality of life too. Mm-hmm. It makes me think of the first mantra in the Ishopanishad, which says, Krishna gives you everything, gives you your quota, everything for life. And it's not just bare bones subsistence, it's to flourish, it's to thrive. And that in and of itself, to have that is what is, absolutely necessary for spiritual life in a lot of ways. So anyone seeking to seek that in the world, I think there's a deep element of spirituality that's there. And I think that's what's inspiring a lot of devotees to okay, we need to be concerned about these things. We need to really step up and find our place, how we can help serve these different movements for justice, for meaning, for dignity in the world.
And we have to be relevant in some way. And relevant, and relevant doesn't mean we have to mirror necessarily, but if we don't have a way of talking about being engaged in today's issues, I mean, Bhakti Swami's, did books on this. If we don't have a way of being engaged in these issues and speaking about what justice means and what it looks like, or whatever, if we don't find a way of doing that, then we will not attract the way in which we can attract the youth of today, the way in which we should, I think, be attracting the youth of today. And we have to be able to find a way to speak about that in a way that feels sort of authentic to our teachings, and also allows for action.
Yeah. This question of how we approach others, when we were talking the other day, we were mentioning about the kind of very famous exchange between Bhakti Swami and Srila Prabhupada, where this was early on in Bhakti Swami's commitment to Krishna consciousness, and as a black-bodied devotee, he was experiencing racist attitudes from other devotees, hearing about this from other black devotees. And then he approached Prabhupada, and Prabhupada said, if you're, to paraphrase, if you're bothered by this racism and it's affecting your consciousness, you're no better than those who have this kind of consciousness,
Mm-hmm.
which is always, and it's an exceptionally, it's always an exceptionally challenging exchange to kind of interpret. But you had a really interesting realization about this, which I wondered if you could share.
Well, the interesting thing about it is that Krishna, like I think he does this with everybody, but I see him having conversations with me about things.
Mm-hmm.
Meaning the same thing came up like 3 times in the course of 2 weeks.
Yeah.
It came up in teachings and about, and each one sort of added a little bit more. The first one, I was like, I don't know what you're talking about, and I don't know what to do with what you just said. And it sounds like what you're telling me is like, I shouldn't like, suck it up, buttercup.
Yeah.
And by the 3rd time, again, it was Radhanath Swami again, and it was in his 5-hour memorial. If you haven't listened to that, anyone who has not listened to that should listen to that. His 5-hour memorial of Bhakti Tirtha Maharaj that's on YouTube.
Mm-hmm.
And what he said is that he had a conversation with Bhakti Tirtha Maharaj about it, and that what he said, the reason that that particular advice was given to him was that I likened it to the Matrix, in which in which the Oracle says to Neo, I told you what you need to hear at the time, and that Prabhupada could see the work that Bhakti Tirtha Maharaj needed to do in the world. That he needed to go back behind the Iron Curtain. That he needed to get this. He needed to have this particular foundation to become the Vaishnava and become the guy who would have such an impact on so many. He needed to get this. He needed to get it quick. He needed to get it early. And that put a whole other spin on this, because we know that that Srila Prabhupada was a very time, place, and circumstances. You can see him saying very different, almost opposite things to different people.
Yeah.
Why? Because it was what they needed to hear, right? And so sometimes we try to extrapolate that message to everybody, and it isn't necessarily that message which needs to necessarily go to everybody. And it's one of those things that it's an interesting internal meditation. But when you tell someone else, if you're feeling that way, it's because you're too much on the bodily concept. Without like a really deep, strong relationship with that person, that can really just be a sort of violence. Right? Because that's not. It's an internal. It's not a whip. It's not a like get over yourself. It's not a way of invalidating what someone is going through in the moment. And it comes across that way often when it comes across in a talk that is not necessarily an individual conversation with someone you love who is asking for something, and this is the answer to that, right? And so I think people should be careful. And this whole thing around the bodily concept, which I think is more of an internal thing as opposed to a, way we hold other people accountable. It's the way we hold ourselves accountable. It's not something for holding other people accountable. Yeah.
Right. Yeah. It's just, I think this is a constant theme of these conversations. I think I'm really trying to discern what engaged bhakti is. We're constantly coming back to the sense of how we understand that first teaching of the Gita, that you're not the body. And like everything in Krishna consciousness, it's simple, but it's complicated. And, we can understand in one sense, it's not an exceptionally like abstract philosophical teaching. It's like you're the soul within, and the body is the vessel. And the more you're attached to this as yourself, the more difficult things are going to be. And I think I think also Prabhupada was really, because it's the same thing kind of as the teaching in the 247 of the Gita, like not to be attached to the fruits of your action, like, oh, you're not your body, like that's also, it goes against everything in our conditioning. And I think, Prabhupada was very, I think a lot of the first devotees and disciples of Prabhupada, were trying to understand that teaching, and we're also, also in a very like renounced to the original time of ISKCON, was very, people were more kind of renounced ashrams and things like that. And I think, my experience over time is, like you understand that teaching in a very almost blunt way, but then you have to learn how to, you have to kind of untangle it a little bit and see what the different elements and different nuances and different complexities of it are. And I think you're speaking about what the guru does especially well is understanding the context of each person that is their disciple. And that's something that it's a special task for the guru, but as you're saying in your own service, when people come up to you and they're in pain, it's like, how do you approach them? Like how do you try to understand the context of where they're coming from? Not as some like abstract thing, but as a living being. And that's the real test of how how good we are at spreading the love that we've gotten.
Yeah, and can we meet people in some way? That bridge, we have to be the bridge between our teachings and where people are.
Yeah.
And can we meet them where they are in a way that they can relate to and connect to? I think I heard someone once say, well, the teachings are such that those who are like desperate will they'll just get it. And it's like, I don't think that's our calling. I think our calling is to actually find ways to connect and to help people connect. And that means we have to be, that's what Prabhupada did. It's exactly what he did. The way in which ISKCON looked here in the West was very different from where he'd come from, in part because that's what he needed to do to connect with where he found himself and the people that he found himself with. And I think we need to continue to figure out how we do that and stay true to the essence of our teachings.
Yeah. And I go back to this point about like syncretism and the mixing, the natural mixing. I think part of what engagement means is not being afraid to relate to the pain of somebody else, to relate to who they are as a human being. I think one of the first conversations I had on these podcasts with Gopal Patel was we were just talking about how, don't forget to be a human being while you're practicing Krishna consciousness. Like we have to love ourselves. And we have to love the human body is an exceptional vessel for understanding our relationship with Krishna and remembering and practicing and coming to the goal of love of God. And we should embrace our humanity. And this is a common problem, I think, amongst many different religious or spiritual people when we become so try to storm the gates of heaven too quickly. But I think in the sense too, like what engagement means is having a willingness to mix, a willingness to kind of mix to a certain extent, and of course never try to compromise the essential values of our practice, but being able to learn from others. I think there's something, my Professor John Tatamanal writes about this and kind of how he talks about religious diversity and hospitality, like being hospitable to our neighbor, welcoming them in and taking them for who they are without imposing all of these categories and conditionings. And in that hospitality, that radical hospitality, as he describes it, real love and real devotion can manifest between people, which is a reflection of what Krishna is doing for us.
I think one of the things that, at some point further down the line, when I look back, I'll understand, like I could have come to Krishna consciousness when I was 22, 23, 24, I could have, but that wasn't his plan. And so there's a reason that I've walked the path that I've walked. And I don't know that I see the entire reason.
Yeah.
But that is, to me, it's that piece, like what are the pieces from each of these things that are important that I need to take along with me? It's like these little pieces of bags or little whatever that I need to take along with me that are a part of my larger experience and part of how I connect with people going forward. There's a reason that was my path as opposed to, just back to straightforward or, picking it up when I was a kid kind of thing.
Yeah.
And so I'm always trying to keeping that in my head. There's a reason that this is the way Krishna wanted me to come.
Yeah, that's amazing. Well, thank you so much for this conversation. And, we're both members of the Bhakti Center, which is such an amazing community in New York. And it's been tough the past few months not being able to kind of go down there regularly. Is
Mm-hmm.
hopefully now things are starting to open up again. And, but yeah, it's an honor to be in the community with you. It's an amazing place. And magical place too, because it's right around the corner from where it all started too. There's just such a powerful energy there.
Yeah, I feel very fortunate that is where I landed. Very, very fortunate, because it you can be yourself.
Yeah, that's yeah.
Right? You can be yourself, right? You don't have to turn into somebody else.
Yeah.
To practice Krishna consciousness, and I think that's really important.
Yeah, and that's such the example that Radhanath Swami sets, guiding and everyone who's helped to build that community up. It's just such a welcoming place. And I appreciate the intelligence behind it too, because the East Village, I often say the East Village is like one of those places where everything cool in the universe emanates from. So it's such a culturally sophisticated place, actually. I mean, I the time I lived there, I still miss living there, because it's kind of, when I go back there, I feel like, oh, this is real New York, like that real. It's all kind of bougie and gentrified now, but it's still got that that vibe to it, the Allen Ginsberg vibe to it. So it's just such the community is such an amazing example of how to, like a perfect example of how to keep the core, keep that essential element, but then just be so welcoming and hospitable to others. It's a wonderful example.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. For a little while, I was actually for 2 years, I did reception at the Bhakti Center, and one of my meditations was that I am Krishna's welcoming committee.
Yeah, right.
That's what it means to be reception, right? It's like that. This is how you greet people as they come in that door. You're his ambassador at the door right now.
Mm-hmm.
Right? So welcoming everyone in, because he doesn't care. Yeah. All the things we care about, he does not care about at all.
That's right. I never thought about it that way, but that makes so much sense.
This young woman I was talking about, she was talking about how she was concerned about bhakti and taking on what she perceived as a Hindu practice, and that it was taking on someone else's practice was a sort of a cultural appropriation. And I said, I hear you, but I am really clear: the divine does not care.
Yeah.
Does not care. Doesn't. He wants to reach whomever he can, however they can. Mm-hmm. And he will take every single one of us. We have to have a certain mind around it, yes, but he does all of these things that are so important to us, not important to him at all.
Yeah. Thank you for being such a wonderful example of how to be welcoming and how to approach others with deep love and compassion. I'm really grateful for you and everything that you do. And thank you so much for the conversation.
Thank you very, very much. I really appreciate it. I look forward to seeing this as it unfolds, Engaged Bhakti as it unfolds. Learning a lot from it. So thank you very much.
Thank you, everybody who listened. And if you're on our YouTube page, please subscribe. You'll be able to get all of our new podcasts as they come out directly to you. And check out also our Facebook page, and you can like us there. And we'll be back soon with another Engaged Bhakti podcast. Hari Bol.
Hare Krishna.